Let's talk about how to test for food allergies and food intolerances. All right, are you ready to open up the biggest can of worms in the medical community? Good, I hope so, me too. Let's do it. Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Wangen, the founder and medical director of the IBS Treatment Center. I've been diagnosing and testing for food allergies and intolerances for nearly 25 years, and what I've learned is that it's an incredibly confusing area of medicine, which is why I wanted to do this video. Now, what's the difference between an allergy and intolerance? Because we have to explain that before we can talk about how we test for these. And I know it's a pain and you don't want to do this, but believe me, once you hear me talk about it, it's going to make a whole lot more sense. So hear me out here. These terms are not defined by science or by logic as much as you think they are. And science tried, by the way, but it lost. So they are defined by tradition. So let me explain. A food allergy is defined by allergy doctors. And they define an allergy by symptoms. And what they call an allergy is usually one of about 5 different symptoms. So here you go. If you have anaphylaxis, which is where you maybe heard of your tongue or your mouth swells up and you have trouble breathing, that is considered an allergic reaction. The other allergic reactions include allergic rhinitis, and that's where you have basically itchy eyes, runny nose, that kind of thing. Then there's hives, which is swelling and itching of the skin. You've probably heard of that. There's eczema. And there's asthma. So testing for these types of allergies is often done by an allergist. And they will likely do a skin scratch or a skin prick test to see if your skin swells up in reaction to a food, and then if it triggers any of those symptoms. And if it does, then it's considered an allergy, right? That's how allergies have been defined up to this point. Now, in the case of allergies, we often see IgE antibodies in the blood. So with these kinds of reactions, but we don't always see that, but we often do. And if you do have elevated IgE antibodies to a food, but you don't have any of those symptoms I just mentioned, those 5 symptoms that we just talked about, then it's unlikely that your allergist is going to diagnose you with an allergy. They're most likely going to ignore those results because they're inconvenient and they're just going to call them irrelevant. Now, I just had to give you a sense of that so you got this picture of what the context is, the paradigm is for allergies, what's looked at as an allergy. It's not based on the blood work, it's based on the symptoms. Now, I don't think that's great science when you blow off blood work just because you don't like it, but that's literally usually what happens. Now, skin testing itself still has a lot of value, and they use it, of course, for those symptoms, but it's only for a limited number of reactions, right? It's for anaphylaxis, allergic rhinitis, hives, eczema, and asthma. That's what we use it for. So we should use it, but realize that it has limitations. Now, what's an intolerance? Well, an intolerance may be even more confusing because at this point, you might be tempted to think, well, an intolerance is not an inflammatory reaction because we just talked about those other inflammatory reactions. Or you might think it does not involve the immune system. Well, that's not usually the case. And so let's take a look at some examples. Now, what about celiac disease? So celiac disease is what we call that a gluten intolerance, right? If you know anything about it, it's been called a gluten intolerance. And we know that the immune system is clearly involved because we measure immune reactions. In celiac disease, we can measure IgG and IgA antibodies, and we can in gluten intolerance, right? And we know that it can cause all kinds of symptoms, including all kinds of inflammatory symptoms, because all that's been well established in celiac disease. But it's probably not going to cause one of the symptoms that we've mentioned and defined as allergy symptoms. Although it can cause hives, and it can also cause a type of skin reaction that's very, very similar to eczema. So why is this called an intolerance? Why is it called gluten intolerance? It just is, right? That's just the way it's always been, and it's not going to change anytime soon. That's all I can tell you. That's just how it's known. All right, now let's consider another kind of intolerance. Let's look at lactose intolerance. Now, lactose intolerance is not an immune reaction. It's not an antibody reaction. It doesn't show up on blood tests. It's just totally different. A lactose intolerance is an enzyme deficiency. So people who don't have this enzyme have trouble digesting lactose, which of course is in milk, but it's in milk sugar. You don't have the enzyme, so it's an enzyme deficiency. So the word, though, intolerance, is used in lactose intolerance and it's used in gluten intolerance, but those are completely different types of things. So as you can tell now, the word intolerance is not consistently used in medicine and it has no real good standard, and it doesn't actually really mean anything other than you have a problem with the food. So I'm sorry to say, that's literally what intolerance is. So how do you test for food intolerances? Well, disregarding enzyme deficiencies like lactose intolerance, that's what we're going to focus on, though, is testing for the majority of food intolerances. And that's, of course, what the title of this video is, so I'm sure you're like, okay, let's get to this already. Let's talk about it, because that's what you want to know. So, all right, let's do it now. So I have found that food antibody testing is extremely helpful in testing for what most people call a food intolerance. And antibodies are produced by the immune system, just like you produce antibodies against a virus, for example. You can produce antibodies against foods. Now recall that we also talked about antibodies when we discussed testing for food allergies. So we talked about IgE antibodies. Sometimes they do that in testing for food allergies. Now we're talking about food intolerances, but we could be calling these allergies as well, and we would not be incorrect. These are immune reactions. They are being antibodies that are produced by the immune system. But of course, most doctors are not calling these allergies. And actually, they probably don't know what to call them, but they're kind of throwing it in the intolerance group. But you could call them allergies if you like. And who are doctors to tell you that you're wrong? Don't let them do that. Because I mean, hey, the medical system has already made a mess of these words, like we just said. And that's their problem, not yours. Call them whatever you like. All right, so let's go back to the matter at hand of measuring antibodies to understand food intolerances. So first I want to point out that people do not normally produce antibodies against food. I think this is a really critical point, because if I had $1 for every time a patient told me when they came back to see me that their doctor told them that everyone produces antibodies against food, or that these results are meaningless and don't mean anything, I'd have a lot of money if I get $1 for every one of those times. That idea that everybody produces antibodies against foods, or that these results are meaningless, that's a lot of hooey. That's just made up nonsense, and it's definitely not science. It's just based on fear and ignorance of these kind of results. Those doctors didn't learn that in medical school. They didn't learn it in the medical research, because there's never been any evidence or any research that that's the case, or that, that people normally produce antibodies against food. And they don't. I've literally run thousands of these tests, and most people don't have antibodies to most foods. That's just the way it is. So when you do have antibodies against a food, you need to ask yourself a question. What is really going on here? Why is my immune system reacting against this food? Because it's not normal. And you should be concerned, because that is a signal. That's a sign from your body that something's going on that would normally be happening. Second, you need to know that just because you have an antibody reaction against a food does not mean that you are going to be able to notice any symptoms from that food, that it's causing symptoms. And so that's really important, because just because you can't feel the antibody reaction does not mean that the lab work is wrong. It just means that it may not be causing a symptom that you can see or feel right now. So I'm going to give you a really clear example of this that the medical science has taught us. Now, what many people know something about celiac disease, right? You've heard of celiac disease. Now, in celiac disease, people have antibodies that show they have celiac disease. Those are measurable, and it helps define celiac disease. Now, most people and most doctors probably assume that everybody who's celiac and who has those antibodies, that those people are very sick. Now, there's a reason that most people assume that, because most people don't get tested for celiac disease until they are very sick. However, large studies, I'm talking about lots and lots of people who've been tested and looked at, those studies have clearly shown that about half of all people who test positive for celiac disease are asymptomatic. It means they don't have any symptoms. They didn't notice any symptoms when they ate gluten. But that does not mean that they don't have celiac disease. And it doesn't mean that there aren't any negative impacts on their body when they eat gluten. Because we know that there are. We know that they just can't feel it. But we know that this celiac disease is bad for them. So the same thing is true when you have an antibody reaction against a food, that whether it's an IgE reaction or an IgG reaction or an IgA reaction, those are not normal reactions, and it's leading to some kind of inflammatory response somewhere, even if you can't feel it. And IgE and IgA and IgG are different types of antibodies that we can measure. And when looking for these antibodies, we normally look in the blood, but they might also be found in the stool or even in the mucous membranes. And in each place and in each type of antibody is different and represents something different. So you don't expect all of them to match, right? You can't test them in different places and expect them all to match. Or you can't expect IgE and IgA and IgG to match, because they're not looking at the same thing. They are usually not going to match, number one, and they are different ways of looking into the immune system to get a glimpse of what is happening there. So they're each valuable tools, but they're not going to be exactly the same in most cases, meaning they're not all going to be positive or all going to be negative, even if you're looking at a reaction to the same food. They're also not the kinds of tests that most doctors are going to do. So even doctors who do these kinds of tests don't always know what to do with the results, because this is a really, really fringe area. I mean, it's just the wild, wild west of what, let's just say, is an already really interesting medical system. And you're out there oftentimes just left to your own devices trying to understand what this stuff means. Just know that it does have meaning, and it's not there just for no reason. So the challenge with these tests is also challenging for the labs, not just for you, because this is really delicate lab work and it's fraught with potential for error. So a good lab can produce the same results over and over again from the same person, the same blood. And that is what defines a good lab. That's quality control. That's high reproducibility. A bad lab can't do that. And your lab work, you should know this, and I know this from working with thousands of patients on this and seeing lots of lab work. Your lab work normally is not going to change much, certainly not over weeks or even months, and often even years, unless you change your diet. Because once you change your diet, then your antibody levels can change, because you're not exposing your immune system to the same thing that you were before. Now, testing for IgG and IgA antibodies is how you test for most food intolerances. Now let's talk about elimination diets, because there are reactions for which there are no tests. So the only way to figure out these type of reactions is to take the foods out of your diet. And don't underestimate the value of elimination diets, because they can be really helpful and really useful. And there are a lot of food reactions that simply won't show up on any kind of test, any kind of tool that we have available to us. And the best way, and really the only way to figure out if you have these kind of reactions, is to remove it from your diet. And this is generally how people discover if they have a reaction to things like food additives or preservatives or artificial colors or artificial flavors, artificial sugars, and things like that. There are a lot of things for which there's no really good test, and I certainly haven't seen a good test for them, even if there are some tests out there that claim to be able to test those things. Now, this is also how many food intolerances and allergies are discovered because people often take things out of their diet and find they feel better. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with this. And I encourage you to tune in to what's going on in your body and trust your instincts, because when that happens, you're probably figuring something out really valuable. Don't wait around for somebody else, somebody like me or a doc, to verify it. Hey, you learned something super valuable that we couldn't possibly know unless you told us. That's the only way we're going to know, is you're going to say, wow, I took this out and I felt better. Now, there are two keys to making this kind of thing work, taking foods out of your diet, and to understand, if that's really the case, if that food's a problem. The first is that you, like we say, you need to be really in tune with your body and how you're feeling. You got to pay attention to everything in your health, like literally everything from your energy to your sleep to your immune system, your headaches, your heartburn, your digestion, your mental state, right? Your clarity of thought. All of these things are super important because they all play a role. They're all part of your health, right? And only you will know. Nobody else is going to know. I mean, maybe later on they'll see it when your skin looks good or your energy is great. The second key is that you have to be very aware of everything that you're eating, everything you're putting in your mouth, because you've got to read every single ingredient. And then you have to avoid the substance that you're testing long enough for it to make a difference. And that might take a day or two, or it might take weeks. I mean, sometimes it takes a month or more. So I want to give you an example. Let's take, for example, avoiding dairy. So if it's dairy, you have to do a lot more than just avoid milk, like a glass of milk or some really obvious milk product. You have to know every word that means dairy. You have to know what whey is, and casein is, and lactoalbumin, and all. These are components. These are things that are derived from dairy that are used in ingredients in other foods. And you have to be reading those ingredients and avoiding all dairy, right? Not just the super obvious stuff. And you have to avoid the dairy in your chocolate. You have to avoid the dairy in the whey in the protein bar. You have to avoid the milk that's in the bread product, right? And the latte, all these things, right? The cheese is a dairy product, right? Yogurt's a dairy product. All of these things are dairy, even butter. You have to know that, because if you don't, then you're not really avoiding dairy, and then you're probably not going to notice a difference if that happens to be the food that you really need to be avoiding, right? So what we're talking about here is an antibody reaction to dairy, not a lactose intolerance. Don't confuse those two, because a lactose intolerance, you can eat dairy products that don't have lactose, or you can take an enzyme, right? That's what lactate is, and you can still eat dairy because it'll break down the lactose for you. You can't do that if you have a dairy, what we define as an intolerance in this long video, right? That's really more of an allergy than an intolerance. At least I think that helps you understand it better. That's how you're going to learn these things. So you got to pay attention after you've cut all those foods out. You got to pay attention for a long time. And then if you weren't sure that it made any difference when you avoid the food, it should get really clear when you reintroduce it. All right, so there you have it. Those are the three most useful and reproducible ways to test for food allergies and intolerance. There's traditional allergy skin testing. There's unconventional but far more comprehensive IgG and IgA antibody testing. And there's elimination diets. None of these is perfect, but they're all really useful tools. Will get you a long, long ways. And none of them, though, however, can replace each other, right? They each have their own value. So I wish you the best of luck in figuring this out and working on your food reactions. In my clinical experience, this is literally the most significant thing that makes a difference in patients' lives, and personally has made just an incredible impact in my life as well, more than anything else. Now, I acknowledge it's not always easy to do, and there are other factors that can make you feel reactive to foods too. But this is totally worth it and really important stuff. So if you need help sorting any of this out, please contact us here at the IBS Treatment Center. That's literally what we do. We're specialists in that. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more information on this subject and related topics on improving your health. Thank you for watching.